Welcome to another Youth Culture screencast, and what we're going to look at in this short video is the experiences of young people in education. And young people obviously spend a lot of time inside educational institutions, so the final topic within the Youth Culture unit focuses on the experiences of young people inside schools. Now, young people experience and react to education in a wide variety of ways. And these responses or adaptations frequently take the form of pupil subcultures, which can influence students' motivation in school and their levels of achievement. So this term pupil subcultures refers to a group of students who share some values, norms and behaviour which give them a sense of group identity and belonging. Now, as we can see from this diagram, pupil subcultures vary. So at one extreme, we've got what we might call pro-school subcultures. So a pro-school subculture is a group of students organised around a set of values, attitudes and behaviour which generally conforms to the academic aims, ethos and rules of a school. And then at the other extreme, we've got anti-school subcultures, which are sometimes called a counter-school subculture, which consist of groups of pupils who rebel against the school for various reasons and develop an alternative set of deviant values, attitudes and behaviour in direct opposition to the aims of the school. A classic ethnographic study of anti-school subcultures is Learning to Labour by Paul Willis. So Willis studied a group of 12 working class male pupils in a comprehensive school in Wolverhampton, and he referred to this group of pupils as the lads, and they developed an anti-school subculture that was in opposition to the aims of the school. So the lads attached little value to the norms of the school, to its values, to gaining qualifications, and instead their main priority was to free themselves from control by the school, to avoid or disrupt lessons, and to have a laugh. Now, although sociologists have often focused on the extreme endpoints of this continuum, so they've either focused on the pro-school subcultures, or like Paul Willis, they've been interested in explaining the anti-school subcultures, there are obviously a variety of responses to education that might fall somewhere between these two extremes. For example, Woods identifies at least 8 different pupil responses to the experience of schooling. And what I'd like you to do after you've watched this screencast is to look up Woods' work, have a look at the 8 different pupil responses to school that he identifies, and have a think about which one best described your experience of education, your adaptation to education, and also have a think about whether or not your adaptation, your response to education was always the same, or whether or not it changed. Okay, what we're going to do in the remaining part of this screencast is have a look at this question. We're going to focus on the formation of anti-school subcultures. We're going to have a look at how these types of subcultures develop within school, and we're going to look at a variety of factors both within the school and also factors that are external to the school. Now, a very useful perspective for understanding the processes that occur within schools and within the classroom is a theory called symbolic interactionism. And interactionism is an approach to sociology based on the idea that human beings act towards things on the basis of how they interpret them, on the basis of the meanings that they ascribe to those things. So, for example, in the context of school and the classroom, students might try harder at school and might be more likely to develop a pro-school subculture when school means something that they can succeed at. Whereas if students interpret school as something that they're not very good at, as something that they can't succeed at, then they're more likely to develop a negative response. And interactionists argue that the meaning that we attach to the experience of going to school, so the interpretation that we give to that experience, is something which is created, modified and sustained through our social interaction with other students and of course with our teachers. And interactionists argue that the labels applied by teachers to pupils are really important in shaping these meanings. So the teacher might consciously or unconsciously communicate the positive or negative label to the pupil via things like their facial expressions, their tone of voice, the encouragement or lack of encouragement that they give to certain students, comments about work, use of praise and discipline. And as a result of these processes, there's often a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. In other words, the pupil will sometimes internalize the teacher label and eventually conform to the prediction or prophecy that the teacher made about that student. Now, one of the most significant ways in which teacher labelling can affect students' interpretations of education is the set or stream that they're put in. So most schools will organise pupils into ability groups, and it's pupils that have been put into the lower ability groups who are more likely to develop an anti-school subculture where they reject the school's values and follow their own deviant values instead. So according to Hargreaves, lower set groups are often a fertile breeding ground for the development of an anti-school subculture that takes its social norms from the school but inverts them, turns them upside down. In other words, rather than getting their status from academic achievement and teacher approval, students in these anti-school subcultures get their status from playing truant, answering back to the teacher, messing around, and generally trying to disrupt the smooth running of the classroom as much as they can. So we might call this a subculture of resistance and an anti-learning subculture, and it provides a means for pupils to feel better about themselves, to improve their self-esteem by giving them status in the eyes of their peer group, which has been denied to them by the school. So this is very similar to the work that we looked at in the previous screencast on status frustration. Now, most of the classic sociological studies of pupil subcultures, such as Paul Willis's famous book Learning to Labour, have focused on boys. And there's been an assumption in the sociological literature that boys are the most likely to develop an anti-school subculture. However, in a recent book, Lads and Ladettes in School, Caroline Jackson focuses on a growing number of girls within school who, in her words, are smoking, drinking, swearing, and disrupting lessons. And she uses the term laddishness to describe these types of behaviours. And Jackson argues that the development of anti-school subcultures, of laddish behaviour, can have important advantages from the perspectives of many boys and increasingly many girls. So she argues that the development of laddish behaviour makes pupils appear cool and popular. So if they have a laugh and mess about in class, it avoids the fear of social failure, of not getting approval from the peer group. And secondly, she argues that there's so much academic pressure within schools that there's now a very strong fear of academic failure. and of being regarded as stupid. And being laddish gets around that to some extent because you pretend that you haven't worked and so expect to fail, and if you do well, you're seen as a genius because others think that you succeeded without any effort. And if you just hit the pause button and read this quotation from one of the students that Jackson interviewed, you'll see the difficult balancing act that students might have to perform in order to do academically well but remain socially popular. One interesting implication of Jackson's research is maybe an inappropriate curriculum and assessment regime is making things worse. So an education system that is geared around more or less constant monitoring and testing may increase the fear of failure in students, and this might lead to more students adopting self-protection strategies, of which laddishness, she argues, is an increasingly important component. Okay, let's now end this screencast by briefly looking at some of the factors outside of the school, so some of the external factors that might also lead to the development of anti-school subcultures. And some sociologists have argued that the social background that students come from can affect their attitude towards education when they're in the classroom. So some sociologists, for example, have argued that students from poorer backgrounds may be socialised into attaching less importance to school than their middle-class counterparts, and this kind of explanation is sometimes referred to as cultural deprivation theory. And this might mean that certain types of students don't have sufficient parental support. The educationalist Tony Sewell argues that for a number of black boys, status within education is gained by being seen as the toughest in school. So this encourages them, he argues, to focus on non-academic ways of earning status, so they're more likely to develop an anti-school subculture. And Sewell links this to factors outside of the school. So he thinks that what is to blame for these types of negative attitudes towards academic education is black street culture and the high number of single-parent families within the black African Caribbean population. So Sewell argues that within these anti-school subcultures, to work hard at school is to sell out or to act white, and that formidable peer pressure is applied to those students who are uncool enough to appear to be keen on lessons and homework. However, Sewell's ideas have been heavily criticised by other sociologists who've argued that this type of explanation is essentially blaming the victim, and that black boys fail in the education system not because of their own culture, but because of structural factors such as racism and poverty. For example, David Gilburn argues that there is a problem of institutional racism within British schools, where black males in particular are more likely to be seen as a threat and as disrupted by teachers. And this leads to more negative stereotypes and labelling of this particular group. As we saw in the previous screencast, the same kind of claims that Tony Sewell is making about black street culture have also been made about working class life and their so-called focal concerns. So from this perspective, working class students who develop an anti-school subculture are merely acting out and exaggerating the mainstream values of working class subcultures. But of course the problem of seeing working class life as being inherently deviant is it risks negatively stereotyping and demonising people from these types of backgrounds. And perhaps these types of explanations have an ideological dimension. Perhaps this is partly about misdirection.